Victor Timely had a very untimely demise. By that, I mean he was turned into rainbow spaghetti by cosmic radiation.
Always knew if you were the weight and you would die.
But hey, he volunteered, even though the Victor we saw wasn't the bravest guy. In fact, he was a bit of a con man and a coward.
You look all over me.
He was brave because after seeing his face all over the TVA, he, like us, deduced that he was destined to become He Who Remains. So in his mind, how could he die?
It should be me.
He's not being brave, he thinks that he's destined to become the ruler of the multiverse. But he wasn't destined to do anything except maybe bring the handbook to OB. He was just a pawn in Kang's plan to take over the multiverse. Not to mention this whole attempt to save the TVA was a huge miscalculation. I mean, OB is way out of pocket for even letting him go out there. Do you miss our Victor already? Comment below.